welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke. My guest this week is Mark Vernon. Mark is a psychotherapist and writer whose work focuses on spirituality in the Christian tradition. He has degrees in theology and physics from Oxford and Durham University, and also has a PhD in ancient Greek philosophy from the University of Warwick. Today, we discuss mysticism and its relationship to Christianity. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Mark Vernon. Mark, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me on. It's good to speak.
Yeah, definitely. Looking forward to this. So you have a really interesting background. Maybe you wouldn't mind starting by sharing a bit about your kind of journey to this point.
I mean, I guess that the moments that might be significant for our conversation are that I used to be an Anglican clergyman, a priest in the Church of England, and that was very good in some ways. It helped me within theological education and made me realize that I'm interested in spiritual matters, for want of a better expression. But I, through a combo of disillusionment with the church and a kind of personal breakdown, left that after about 3 years. And then that took me to working on Plato in a PhD, in a kind of quest to get a big picture, given that I felt the Christian one at that point wasn't working. And although kind of flirted with materialism, enlightenment, values in the secular world, and feeling I might have finally shed off the religious yoke and entered the 20th century, still was the 20th century at that point, kind of had to admit that I was more agnostic than atheist. And then really through discovering contemplative practices, found and psychotherapy, I should put the two together because I now work as a psychotherapist. So inner life, broadly speaking, realized there was another way of connecting with all these things, which I wasn't ignorant of the traditions before. In fact, I'd done a kind of gap year with a sort of semi-monastic group, but I didn't think they quite knew what they were doing. And it's one of these things where I think that Eastern traditions have come back into the West and have not just brought their own traditions, and they're in the process of being remade as they hit Western conditions, but it is also helping to revive lost mystical traditions in the West. I incline to a theistic picture, and also because Christianity is my kind of first language in spiritual terms, have now found a way back into that tradition, but very much with an openness to others, most recently particularly Vedantic traditions and Sufi traditions, that feel to me very complementary in opening up the broadly theistic take on mystical sight.
Right. And when you first became interested in joining the clergy, what was your feeling about Christianity then, if it wasn't coming from this kind of more mystical tradition?
Well, I was born and raised in a church family, so I don't know, as I've got older, I realized how much that air did actually shape me, sensing that there's something there that both my parents sensed as well. And but I think that I can see now that the Church of England was kind of becoming uncoupled in various ways at that point. And so it's got very confused about its identity, I guess. And so it's become very concerned about how it survives, you might say, in this world, with not just its social status, but the social good that it does. And through some of the pressures of modern life around issues like sexuality, around the role of women, has sort of become even confused from within, I think. And it becomes a vicious spiral, because you also lose sight of the transcendent vision, which is actually the only way to try and hold the inevitable tensions of also being mortal and being in the secular world. And so I can't quite remember where I started on this now, actually, but anyway.
No, that's a great answer.
I sort of feel a bit, maybe a way of putting it is that I feel a bit of a product of my times over the last, say, 30 years. And that quite inspires me now, trying to work out how not just to critique the church, but how to stand for that which it wants to stand for anyway.
Right. I've seen you say multiple places that you're kind of trying to you're dealing with the relevance of Christianity, maybe trying to make it more relevant. Is that a fair assessment of what you're trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, I think that it is part of the air which we breathe still in the West, often in wonderful buildings, and the memory of rites and times of year. But there's something too, I think, in our soul in the West that can connect with Christianity, particularly the importance of the individual in the West, that you don't really find in the same way, at least in, say, the Indian subcontinent or in the Far East. And I think that Christian mystical understandings of the individual, which is roughly that my and your sense of being an individual is a kind of portal to the oneness of all things, and so ultimately doesn't lead to individualism, separation of us, but leads to the sense of connection, but at a kind of ontological basis rather than, say, an ethical, let alone a biological level. I think that is one of the core hearts of the Christian tradition, and so trying to understand that, know it oneself, of course, primarily, but then so as to be able to articulate it authentically. It feels to me that's an important thing to do. And then that will allow the Christian tradition to be much more open to those that are from the Indian subcontinent in particular, but also Sufism, mystical Islam as well, and be, kind of, often it's been by reading something that's a bit different, that makes you kind of work because you're not quite sure what the terms are and quite how it connects to your own experience. That then illuminates that which you otherwise would, confess or know. Right.
Yeah, and I think your interest in both these kind of unitive, multiple spiritual states that often have this, as you say, a portal to a sense of oneness, but also psychotherapy, also individual work. I think we both share this deep belief that they're both incredibly important, and that we need to be thinking about how the individual relates to this picture as well as just trying to dissolve into oneness, right?
Yeah, I think it's one of the great questions of our times, really, in terms of spiritual questions, and what happens to the individual. And as you will know too, you can be in one circle 1 minute saying that ego dissolution is the goal, and then you can be on a mental health ward where ego dissolution has taken place, and you realize that it can't be as simple as that, because this is not leading to happiness. And I think that it is, well, I've an image which has been very helpful for me has come through working on Dante and the Divine Comedy, and in particularly the third part where he travels through paradise, it becomes clearer and clearer to him that the more the souls that he meets are becoming themselves, the more their individuality is truly radiating from them, the more that they're in harmony with everybody else, and because their individuality enables them to share more and more in the divine unity. And so then various metaphors are deployed, like the mirror of their soul becomes more and more polished, and so they're able to reflect more and more the divine light. But the divine unity is a diversity, a dance, not just a mush. And yeah, so those images I find very helpful, and there's a truth in it. You know, it's sometimes said the more particular a novel is, the more universal it becomes. Or you also know, you know, when you meet people who you regard as spiritual adepts, they are very distinctive characters as well. You know, the Dalai Lama's laugh is unmistakable, and yet somehow it's that particularity that channels much more. So yeah, the psychological and particularly the therapeutic, I think, can be seen as part of spiritual work more broadly. And so, like you're saying, I guess, as you know, when people become freer at the personal level, they actually become fuller at the spiritual level.
Right. Yeah, definitely. For me, I had a long time living with a deep sense of the kind of this unitive, selfless state, but also was suffering when I was not in that state. And so I knew I wasn't at the end of the path, even though those states are often kind of sold as the end of the path. You know, once you've achieved this, that's where you're going. But I think more and more people are realizing that that's often the beginning of the work. You know, you can have these kind of profound awakenings to things being not the way you thought they were, and then in light of that, you can bring your individual self into alignment with that. And I think this synthesis of what we might call spiritual states and ongoing kind of psychotherapeutic self-improvement is really the way we need to be. Is the wisest direction for us to move in. And you mentioned your work on Dante's Divine Comedy. In that, you're kind of arguing that the descent into hell and all of this stuff is it almost like a parallel with Jungian shadow work, like you're moving into the stuff that's most uncomfortable in order to come out the other side in this kind of spiritual place?
I think there are definitely parallels. There's a reason why metaphors of darkness work in both systems, and of course the point about the shadow is that it sticks to you. And certainly Dante discovers that those in infernal states are trapped. They can't escape it. They don't know how to. But I think one of the things that is very alive for me now and speaks to me directly, but also I try and bring into the psychotherapeutic work, is our relationship to suffering. Because I think that one of the things that Dante portrays so well is that an infernal state of mind is where you basically want to escape suffering. You want it to cease. It's got to stop. And it doesn't, because you're in a constant fight with it. And then purgatory is the state where people begin to learn that there's hope in their suffering, and that by leaning into it, by trying to understand it, they start to be able to see through it and around it. And so it becomes a path, it becomes the guide really to more than just the suffering. And my sense of actually spiritual practices as well as psychotherapy, like meditation, where the aim is not to separate yourself from the experience, but is to hold the experience in a wider context. And similarly in psychotherapy, where you do all the work about what happened in the past, what's going on in the present, and so on, in order to kind of contain or hold what's happening, and then that creates space, more freedom for the person to be able to be in dynamic relationship to what's going on. That's a kind of purgatorial state. And then even in paradise, though, Dante still sort of suffers. I put it in inverted commas because things happen to him which are quite devastating if they'd happened in another domain. So, for example, at one point he goes blind, and you read this and think, what on earth's going on? But in the paradisal state, he knows that that is precisely the point at which more is going to be revealed to him. And so suffering has become the way. And it's one of those phrases which is sort of easy to say, but is certainly in mortal life a kind of a constant, I think, growing point, learning point, point of expansion, which I guess, is a reflection of the fact that death will come to us all. And so big question, especially as you get older, is can you approach death not just sort of trying to hold it off for as long as possible, not just to trying to mitigate that which it might bring, although, you know, clearly you might well want to do that, but can you actually embrace it as not just the end of your life, but the telos of your life? And so death has got something to say to you now as a portal into understanding more. So, you know, in these deep traditions, dying before you die is an old mystical injunction, and in Christianity it's told very vividly in the story of Christ's death and resurrection. But we can know that, I think, ourselves, not just have it as a story that happened a long time ago that gives us some hope that, you know, all might be well in the end. No, it can be a living experience, I think. But you try and learn to align, as you say, to that almost every moment, every day. When the little moments of suffering rise up, can you welcome them to step through them and just gradually become more and more with the wider sense of being?
Right. Yeah, and this idea of seeing hell in Dante's Inferno, part of the Divine Comedy, as something to be, you know, as an analogy for this kind of spiritual path, I think is very wise and taken in opposition to what I see as maybe the defining problem with our culture is a sense of the shadow being repressed and just trying to avoid thinking about death, avoid these things. And a correlate of that, I think, you know, you could say that my kind of spiritual path began with contemplating hell when it was taught to me as a very scary thing to be avoided, not as something to be integrated, worked through, and thought about, but something just, you know, stay away from that. It's terrifying. And I've seen you talk about a figure called, is it Evagrius Ponticus?
Yeah. I know he's not a household name, which is a bit of a shame, but yeah, Evagrius Ponticus. Yes, yeah.
Right. And
so he's one of the desert fathers, so one of the early Christian monastics. It's for figures like him that phrases like navel gazing were coined, actually. Navel gazing was thrown at the monks and nuns in the desert. What are you doing sitting around all day gazing at your navels? So yeah.
Oh, okay. And
which I quite like, because it's a sign that this deep mystical tradition is in Christianity,
right.
Forgotten. Yeah, but anyway, sorry, yes, you were saying.
No, and I heard you speaking about how before we had the 7 deadly sins, there was the 8 serious thoughts that he was speaking about, and there seems to be a parallel here in terms of working through things we find challenging versus splitting off from them.
Yeah, you know, he to put it in a nutshell, he basically said, if you sit down and sit still, then you'll find these 8 serious thoughts coming up, and they're things like gluttony, lust, sloth, vainglory, and he realized, though, that they're not what came to be called the 7 mortal or deadly sins, as if they should be somehow avoided, but precisely are. Jung would call it the confrontation with the unconscious. He actually, given the imaginative capabilities of time, saw it often as direct demonic encounters. He realized that he was in these states, was not one actually, but was split off, was fragmented, and that was experienced as attack, which again, you know, psychologically is very vivid actually. I think it's quite often better to think about these things in such ways, and strangely it creates more space, even if it's can be more alarming too. So he was very widely celebrated by figures that ultimately worked into better known monks like Benedict, informed the Benedictine rule, and but precisely because you know, the kind of the dark side is the way to go. That's you know, it's Buddhist summary that the obstacles are the way, because they're the points of expansion, they're the points of growth. So it makes sense.
Right. And you're not going to get to a state of completion or wholeness through avoiding things, right? It's the stuff that you want to avoid that you have to learn to include. But in addition to these, you could say almost archetypes of mental challenges we might face, the idea of the kind of Christ archetype is something that when I started doing kind of psychotherapeutic work, I came to find incredibly inspiring. And up until that point, my kind of spiritual experience had been more in a kind of, you could describe it like a Zen way, where there's not that much talk of love, compassion, and it's more kind of to do with the mind and reality. And then as I healed trauma that had kind of made my emotional side constricted and blocked, as that opened, I suddenly discovered this whole world of, what feels like transpersonal love, and I don't mean that in a supernatural sense, but love that's just deeper than your sense of self, that's just there as part of your mind. And this is also attested to in Buddhist traditions as well. But the figure of Jesus seemed to really resonate deeply, especially, a figure who goes through incredible suffering, but has this kind of this unwavering alignment with being a figure of kind of wholesomeness, maybe is kind of a mild way to put it, but of peace and love and healing for the world. And so I think this idea of Christ consciousness and the Christ archetype is incredibly powerful. And I guess you don't even have to be a Christian to feel that. It feels like when I experienced that, I felt like I got a sense as to why Christianity became so kind of widespread when it did.
Yeah, I think that Christianity and people who go to church, things have got very confusing about like Christ or God even, and so these names are as much stumbling blocks to people as they are helps. And it is a wonderful thing to be able to see through, I think, the mistakes and get something back of the heart of the matter. Christ, even in church services, church liturgies, is often presented as the kind of bridge between us and God, which doesn't sound so bad, but of course the implication there is that God is become separate from us, and if it's not for some kind of cosmic rescue mission, we're doomed. And then I think another knock-on effect of that rescue model is that people feel that they must try and imitate Christ in the sense of conjuring up that which is otherwise bad, against that which is otherwise bad. And so Christianity becomes very moral in its message as well, like you should be like the ideal Christ. And so, the power of guilt in Christianity is absolutely massive. I mean, I've seen it many times. It can really ruin people's spiritual paths, actually. And I think that a lot of it is premised on what's become so big in Western Christianity. It is different, I think, in Eastern Christianity, which is more connected to Eastern traditions and also Platonism, where there isn't this sense of absolute depravity, as Calvin put it, in the human soul, or original sin. Well, I think all Christianity has a sense that something's gone wrong, but Augustine added this sense in original sin that you and I are directly guilty for all that's gone wrong, and that's a pretty big burden to bear. But conversely, the Christ that can be discovered, and I think Dante, just to cite him again, is one of the big figures trying to press for this different case, is the Logos that can discern the nature of being, and not just guide you, but become the guide that's within you, that's part of you, because you're part of the Logos, part of the divine reality as well. And so it's more natural to talk about ignorance of things, rather than a complete separation from the nature of reality, or feeling trapped. And again, the language of trauma and so on then fits much more naturally with that. And also why understanding the trauma, understanding the ignorance is the way that opens the path back again. So yeah, and love has got to be part of that, because it's only then that you have, I think, the freedom to both acknowledge what you don't understand, what's gone wrong, because that definitely happens. There's undoubtedly bad and evil things in the world, but love and forgiveness is the only way, I think, to say, yes, there are those things and there's more. And that's the crucial move, not to try and cut off, not to try and split off, not to feel that part of creation, to use a theistic language, has got to be somehow removed in order for creation to return to the divine. And because ultimately that would be to try and sever God from God. And so is to become a form of lesser theism. It's a partial vision, not the full vision. And so better to maintain the sort of paradoxes, but held with these felt qualities like love and forgiveness. Kindness would be the more natural Buddhist word, of course.
Right.
That's the way that leads to expansion, if you can hold on to these qualities.
Yeah, and I think the idea of trying to be like Jesus, and kind of asking oneself, what would Jesus do? And as you point to, not taking that as an injunction to feel guilty and shameful that you're not immediately like Jesus in the present moment, but as a kind of, to me, it feels like a really powerful signpost as to like, this is the direction, this is the wise direction for all of us to move in. And I especially mean that when it of the teachings around love and forgiveness for absolutely everyone, even the people who put him to death and the Romans who are kind of torturing people. It really seems to me that I don't think it's coincidence that the Christianity spread within the Roman Empire, when I personally, human history, see the Roman Empire as this kind of fever pitch point of human egoism and power and domination and control, creating this situation where people must have thought, how did things get so crazy and so highly stressful and so out of control? And I'm currently in Portugal, and in the local square here, there's a very vivid crucifix of Jesus, life-size, with kind of blood pouring down you. Sometimes you see these very vivid depictions that make you remember, when you're raised Christian, you kind of become desensitized to the fact that this is an image of someone being tortured in a very visceral way. And sometimes these kind of Southern European depictions can kind of bring that back to you in these kind of Catholic traditions. And I was struck when I saw it recently by the thought that I don't think, some people might say that is the behavior, that's our kind of animal side, that's our most base side. But actually, I don't think our most grounded animalistic nature would torture people like that. I think torture is an egoic kind of thing that arises in cultures that are incredibly destabilized and unbound, like the Roman Empire. So I feel like the message of Jesus as this kind of, look, this is the right direction to go, no matter how awful things are, no matter how awfully you're being persecuted, the wise direction is ultimately in this direction of universal love and compassion and healing, which is an incredibly high bar. It's not easy to face incredible persecution and find love and compassion for those who are causing you harm. But I think this is the thing that maybe resonated most deeply with me with the teachings of Christianity, that I really believe that's something we need to all be waking up to in order to have kind of positive social change, which I know is something as well. I think you see a connection with this stuff and positive social change as well, right?
Yes. I think in terms of history, it was sort of unfolding. Socrates, according to Plato, would teach that what's the value to your soul of loving your friends, really it's loving your enemies where you might truly learn something about the reach of love, and that which is good and beautiful. And so again, if the goal is to know more and more, then the difficult way is the way to go. That's kind of an axial theme. The Hebrew prophets would say it's not your sacrifices that God wants a broken and contrite heart. And similarly, with figures like the Buddha and even actually the Taoist figures like Xuanzi is quite big on this as well. But nonetheless, I think that 200, 300, 400 years later, when, with, as you say, the Roman Empire at its pitch, and people felt that this figure, Jesus, had somehow embodied this potential to the supreme degree. And I think that's part of the reason why he was felt to be both fully human, because you have to be fully human because you have to know about mortality and death. But that is precisely what made him fully transparent to the divine as well. And that there wasn't a contradiction in that, precisely the opposite. And then over the first, say, 300 years before Christianity became the majority religion around the Mediterranean, it offered a way of connecting with people that wasn't based on the old assumptions that, say, your family, your kin was the most important connection, or your city of birth was the most important connection. And that was helpful partly because of the oppressive nature of the Roman regime, because it meant that people could form networks of aid and help, and so very practical compassion, and that somehow went underneath the radar of the state at the time, because it wasn't based on family or on city. But I think also actually at the same time kind of work with a tendency which was emerging within the Roman system as well. Say that gradually more and more people became Roman citizens, became freemen in the Roman world. And so that tendency for recognizing the value of the individual over the value of groups was emergent too. I mean, you weren't saying this, but there are quite powerful tendencies in the discussion of the place of Christianity in the modern world to contrast Christianity with the Roman regime, as if it was a completely radical, unimaginable revolution in ethics. And I think that that's done now because people want to stress the value of Christianity now, not just kind of discard it. But I think the truth is that Christianity was working with what was going on, both in its kind of positive developments, like the recognition of freedom and for all individuals, but also in its negative developments, how to offer something that is stronger than the oppressive dynamics of the time, which are undoubtedly there as well. And so gradually made sense to people. Now, there's power politics, as everybody knows, in the origins of Christianity too, particularly in the 3rd, 4th centuries, with Constantine the emperor becoming Christian, and no doubt the one God suited the one emperor that wanted to unify the one empire. That undoubtedly happened as well. So there's multiple layers to this story.
Yeah, it definitely, I mean, without knowing a huge amount about it, my instinct is, you see the original teachings of Jesus and this trajectory of it becoming the state religion of the Roman Empire, then being associated with hierarchical structures and Catholicism, they seem to be at odds. And I almost wonder if it might be because Christianity posed a threat as this kind of anti-imperialist, non-hierarchical way of people associating. I wonder if that's almost why part of why Constantine had to absorb it as a kind of strategic political move, to neutralize it as a threat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably actually he sensed the positive power of Christianity. His predecessor Diocletian had experienced Christianity as threat. It was the Diocletian persecutions that were the worst by quite a long stretch in the pre-Constantine world. But by then it was becoming a significant force in the empire. In the 1st and 2nd centuries after Christ, it was very much a tiny minority pursuit, and so it didn't really threaten anybody in terms of the secular world. Then that changed under Diocletian. But I think that Constantine, he wasn't the first to think that the monotheistic move would be good politically. Other gods had been tried, and sometimes it's said that it's a bit unclear whether Constantine was actually behind the Christian god, or say Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, and hence the story about him seeing the cross in the sun and so on. Was that a kind of mashup of monotheistic perceptions? But I think that maybe this relates a bit back to the difference between East and West, that if you live in a culture that does value the individual, for it not to become a war of all against all, you need to have some sense of unity that transcends all these individuals, but which all these individuals can relate to, so that their individuality is seen as a way of a path to unity, rather than a culture war, where my individuality is weaponized against your individuality. And I think the moral imperative isn't quite enough, that the injunction that we should love others, that we should have compassion, that we should befriend our neighbors. Undoubtedly that's true, but you've got to feel something about the nature of reality, I think, because ultimately it requires you to sacrifice something of yourself. And you can, sacrifice becomes desirable even when you realize that you're letting go into more. And so it is, virtues and so on, you might say, matter because they connect us with more of reality, not ultimately because they make us a good person. And this is why, Christianity is called good news. It really is good news all the way. It's not just like, please a God and you'll get into heaven. No, I think that this is about becoming divine, knowing the divine nature. You are gods. That the early church fathers repeatedly said, God became man that we might become God. And that bold statement, I think, is really needed for our times. It's risky because it easily appeals to vainglory and even manipulation. I mean, that's clear. But nonetheless, don't lose the biggest vision, I think, because we need it now.
Yeah, I think the idea of it as good news really resonates with me when we're talking about this kind of mystical, experiential connection that I think we both have experienced, of discovering that you are really at home in this thing that's much bigger than us, that we're completely part of, and whatever labels we want to put on that. And discovering Gnostic traditions that became heretical. It seems that the idea that we are all Christ, we all have this Christ consciousness within us, is an aspect of the teachings, right? And then maybe also as power became centralized, that became heretical and discouraged. But I think this is something we can all discover. But I also think there's the danger of I expect to see in coming years, especially as kind of psychedelic medicine becomes legal and many people have these kinds of experiences, I expect to see a lot of cases of Jerusalem syndrome, this thing where people go to Jerusalem and they think that they're the reincarnation of Jesus, because it'd be interesting to move in the conversation in this direction actually towards how we put language to these experiences, because I expect our experiences are probably very similar, and because of our personal histories, I have a kind of a slight phobia around anything that could sound supernatural, or I don't use the word like theistic, but I also feel like those words are just words. It doesn't, and in certain moods, I do feel like a concept like God that points to what is beyond concepts. If God means anything, it means the thing that transcends everything else, right? And I think that's a useful label to have. So maybe, I'll let you come back on that. Maybe we can move the conversation in that direction.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the hesitancy that you feel, I can hear as a good hesitancy, because I forget quite who said it, but someone once said, if you really believed in God, you wouldn't use the name, because you've already kind of collapsed what you confess to believe in. So there is the tradition of the apophatic and the silent, and then you're not so far away from Buddhist notions such as emptiness. So that tension's worth holding on to. But yeah, I'm maybe this is my sort of perhaps skepticism. I wonder what you make of this. I wonder about the psychedelic renaissance, or I think what it does do for people is make them realize that the narrow consciousness that they'd assumed was the whole of consciousness is not. And so people have experiences that that kind of wash that away, that do cleanse the doors of perception. But I think that making something of that is another whole task again, and that's where I guess that Jerusalem syndrome comes in, because people get stuck on the peak and identify themselves with the peak, and so think that they're the Messiah or whatever else they might think they are. But the question is how to know this expansive reality in every moment of the day, ultimately, and not just in exceptional moments. And there's always a risk that it's the kind of equal and opposite experience to the trauma. The trauma can grip you for years because of its horror, but I think that the peak experience can grip you for years because of its delight, and both can keep you equally trapped. The trauma may lead to anxiety and fear, whereas the peak leads to addiction or something like that. And so I mean, you said this as well, that in a way, what's most important now, maybe this is sort of round two psychedelic renaissance. If the 60s, where millions dropped acid and the world didn't change that much, is a lesson, because the dropping of the acid isn't really the crucial thing. The thing is how you live on Tuesday, as someone put it. And so a much quieter but more resilient and actually much more dynamic and flexible awareness of these things is what I would take hope in. And again, this is in all the spiritual traditions. In the West, the people like Teresa of Avila, who's become famous for her kind of erotic ecstasies. She said, if you actually read her writings, that's nothing. It's trivial. It was a diversion. It's a disaster in a way that Bernini made his famous sculpture of her being pierced by the arrow of the cherub, because it's so captivating an image. So I think that how to come down is as important as the way up.
Yeah, definitely. And my interest in the psychedelic renaissance came about because for many years before that, I was deeply convinced of what you're saying, the kind of the daily living in light of these realizations, and speaking to people, mainly in a kind of secular, scientifically minded, atheistic people, I got absolutely nowhere. Everyone just dismissed it as kind of supernatural, had no idea, well, not even supernatural, just had no idea what I was talking about, just assumed it was some illusion, probably in my own mind, I guess. And then when the psychedelic renaissance came along, I felt a sense of, it's almost quite a brute force approach where it's like, all right, well, then we can just put people's brains in the right state for them to have these realizations, and then they can go and live their lives in a way that's, that integrates them. But yeah, I think I definitely have this worry that the major pitfall perhaps with psychedelics is that they quickly take you into profoundly different states of consciousness and then return you. And then you have all of the momentum, karma, conditioning, whatever you want to call it, in your body and your mind. That means that you've had this experience of feeling completely at peace and transpersonal love for everyone, and that feels like Christ consciousness. And then there's part of you that, is probably a lot of you in the case of most people, that is not fully healed. And so, hey, it's kind of tempting to be, if I'm like Jesus, then maybe maybe people will like me, and all of this egoic emotional stuff that's unconscious, I think, that feeds into thoughts like maybe I'm the reincarnation of Jesus being very appealing. And so I think people have these rebound effects where, again, once they put language on the experiences, we tend to form our beliefs. We know this through psychology, that we have a lot of biases, that we move in the direction of what feels nice and feels comfortable. And I think this is something, I think it's only by having conversations like this in public and trying to get people to be aware that the aim isn't to have these big experiences and then just take your first instinct around them and run with it. And the aim is to, this is why I tend to, the language I like to use around this stuff is thinking of reality as non-conceptual, because it's fundamentally about letting go, reducing your attachments to models, to ways of thinking about things, and just trying to exist in a peaceful, loving mode that is beyond language. And if you do that, and then you're committed to always holding concepts lightly. So in the same way you were saying about God, you realize you're not actually attached to whatever your concept of God is. You just use that as a pointer to let go and move back into these states. And I think that's probably the best antidote to the whole range of things that could happen as people have these kind of altered states and then come and try to put models on them.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I guess, you see this in therapeutic practice as well, that models really, you have to sort of learn the model, so you have to be kind of committed to it in that way, but so that you can work with it, so it can yield its richness. But then it must become just one model amongst many that you might draw on. And the art really of being any kind of guide or therapist is the art of sensing which model's appropriate just to take the next step for this particular moment. And the indicator is that it leads to movement, or it leads to more, it leads to kind of freedom. And by their fruits ye shall know them, as it says in the Bible. And there's this great, it's a bit of a tension, I think, you'll know this better than me, but I guess that in science, you get prizes when your model is proved to be right, not when your models prove to be useful. So there's big tensions around that can mislead us, I think. Even the sort of appealing to the neuroscience to try and persuade people about the reality of these states, whilst clearly that's valuable in one moment, it brings in a whole load of assumptions about the brain and consciousness, and then even the mechanical approach to these things, like if you can just get the right bunch of hormones or chemicals, and then you can achieve what the spiritual traditions have promised all along. So it's a complicated old business. If there's one kind of thread, I suppose it is the old truism that what matters is what's happening right in this moment, right now, and living and responding, perceiving aright as things are right now. That's in a way what matters most. Not what might happen for good or ill, whether it's the trip you're looking forward to at the weekend or whatever. If you put life on hold waiting for that, you're storing up trouble for yourself.
Right. Yeah, and I think speaking about using science and these models, to me, they should be used really just as a skillful means to help people move in this direction. So I think in the the post-Roman Empire world that we now live in, that has carried a lot of the dynamics of power and propaganda and mistrust and all of these, things that make the world not entirely safe. I think the desire to intellectualize, understand, model, map is actually a very reasonable and useful and actually wise approach, which is partly why I often talk in the language of science. And there's I think a lot of people who wisely are kind of using that to navigate in this space. But then the problem, once you've spent hours and years thinking about things, intellectualizing, modeling, you can mistake that map for the territory and not realize that ultimately you need to let go into the kind of non-conceptual and experiences, and that it's actually, when we talk about what's happening in the brain, that's not the end point. The end point is to let go into the non-conceptual. And when, I think we probably, again, both share the feeling that what I'm calling the non-conceptual is more, it's the real stuff of reality. It's more real than the models and the abstractions. Abstractions by definition are kind of secondary. And when I'm in that mood, I tend to think, if I'm reluctant to use words like, sacred and divine, I'm more comfortable with, but God or theism, then perhaps that reluctance is just an attachment to the models, living in the relative, unwilling to really accept that this is this thing that's beyond words. And I think all of those things are superlative. They point to something that's really the good stuff of existence. It's really hard to put words on it. But in that view, again, I still don't. I always think of supernatural as something that I always want to avoid, because it feels like a kind of a giving up of trying to. I guess I have associations of supernatural as being connected to people saying, kind of, because I said so. I'm not going to tell you how it all hangs together. It's just, here's a phenomenon. It's completely unrelated to everything else. And so I think that's my anxiety around the supernatural. But how do you think about, you used the word a kind of theistic worldview early on in the conversation. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I suppose I've had to work at the word myself, so that when I use it, I'm at least partially aware of what I'm invoking, because I think words have a kind of power over us. They have a vitality too. And so if you feel hesitant about using a word like God, it's probably wise not to use it, because you are invoking a conception that would trap you, that would limit things. That's why you feel nervous about it. And I still feel that quite a lot about God. But the divine or theism, because they're less widely used by those that I think are using them in narrow ways, they feel a bit freer to me. And so, when I feel the quality that is invoked, as you say, the kind of the non-conceptual that's evoked alongside those names, it feels to me like the wider quality is present. And so, at least I know they might be heard in all sorts of ways, but at least for me using them, it feels like I'm looking in the right direction now. Theism, I know something of the history of what people have said, and there's some good advocates now of theism in its wider context. Figures like David Bentley Hart, particularly, I'm fond of, who are reviving the older traditions and relating them to modern understanding of consciousness, and indeed, Indian traditions particularly. And so the words are being liberated in some measure. But yeah, having to check in on what you're actually saying as you're speaking is really important. And it's important if you speak publicly, because if you unwittingly just start using dead tropes that are actually narrowing, you're trapping yourself. So yeah, there's something really vital in wrestling with the language. Like, language is alive. Right. There's a reason why the logos is the logos and all that.
Yeah, and that's reassuring then that I'm not doing it in an unwise way. Thanks for that. Yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time. Where would you send people to if they want to look into your work more?
Cheers. Thank you, James. And yeah, so I try and put everything on my website, which is markvernon.com. I try and do conversations, as you do as well on YouTube. We both speaking to people like Rupert Spira, and making connections in all the ways that we can now, which is really tremendous.
Yeah, I definitely see you as a kind of kindred spirit, someone who's very far-reaching in their interests, and it was a pleasure and a task to feel like I'd adequately prepared for this conversation, because you don't just have one thing that you trot out and talk about all the time. So that was really enjoyable. So thank you for all the stuff you put out in the world.
Yeah, well, look, thanks for making the effort, because I know it's much easier to be an interviewee than it is to be an interviewer. But the dialogue's really worth having, of course, because I think with luck, people have not just heard what we've said to each other, but have felt what we're both trying to reach for, and make more aware, make more conscious in the world.
Definitely, I hope so. Yeah, well, thank you again.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cooke.